I started to notice these cyclical conversations where every conversation with these girls was the same. It was sort of this like, well, but you're from America. How can you live here? It's so awful here. There's so much money there. You have a big house. No, I don't have anything in America. Yeah. But, basically that implied that there's so much money there and this, that, and the other. And but you have freedom. We don't. And you have this and we don't. Yeah. And so I got confronted by this every day of my life for maybe 3 to 4 months. And I just kind of snapped. And I was like, but that's not true. Does the average American live some sort of privileged life of gold where it's like, 2 cars in a house, no worries, no bills, whatever, everything's going to... No. Okay? So I just tried to start setting people straight, and this desire to set people straight sort of expanded my mind into other things. And again, back then when I had more free time, a lot of people started to introduce me to Russian intellectual thinkers, including Dugin at the time. And then when I had the radio show, the opportunity to start a radio show, this was before the Morning Zoo, I sort of did one that was a bit political. My main goal right now, I would say, is to shift from actually the theoretical to actually trying to change the system from within. I got citizenship, so I could run for office here, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to do that. But obviously that takes money and support and some propaganda. Ha ha ha.
What
my favorite word.
Party would you join?
I don't know. Whoever will take me.
Welcome to another episode of Independent Thought and Freedom, where we have conversations with some of the most interesting people around the world who are shaking up politics, society, economies, and ideas. We've had some amazing guests on this program, including The Saker, Paul Craig Roberts, Sheikh Imran Hussein, E. Michael Jones, Cynthia McKinney, and more. If you'd like to support us to reach our next goal of actually putting together live events where we bring some of my best guests side by side on one stage, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber on Patreon. You'll find the link below. Also, if you are an author or researcher with important ideas to share with the world and want to have a greater impact, I'm offering a free masterclass, 3 steps on how to leverage your intellectual authority to become a media personality. The link for that class is in the description as well. And now, on to this week's show. Welcome to Independent Thought and Freedom. The hysteria in the West over Russia and its leader, Vladimir Putin, is difficult to understand rationally. Russia, and by extension Russians, have re-emerged in the US and the UK in particular as a country and a people that you are now officially allowed to publicly hate, ridicule, and slander. It's like George Orwell's Hate Week in 1984, with Russia now taking the place of the last officially hated group, which is al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, and Saddam Hussein. But the world is changing drastically from the old Western-dominated Imperial Order, with the emergence of Russia and China in particular, and perhaps still India and Brazil, maybe even Turkey. We need to understand this change from perspectives outside of the West, which obviously wants to hold on to its dominance and demonize those that are rising. For us in the rest of the world, we have a vested interest in understanding the new power dynamics and where we fit into it. I'm pleased to have on my show today Tim Kirby, an independent journalist, TV and radio host, analyst for the Strategic Culture Foundation. He's also the ideological director and Eurasia Research Fellow and Multimedia Project Director at the Center for Syncretic Studies. He's an American living in Moscow with a valuable and insightful perspective on both countries. Welcome, Tim.
Oh, thank you. I feel very welcome. That's the best intro I think I've ever gotten. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. You deserve it all. I've only recently come to learn of your work, sadly, because I wish I knew about it before. You're doing some amazing stuff.
Well, yeah, I've worked for a long time, especially in political analysis. The problem is that it's one of those things where you can sort of get typecast. And I do a lot of things related to sometimes comedy and humor. And so sometimes people are like, you write about this stuff too? I'm like, that's what I actually want to be doing. But unfortunately, jokes sometimes pay. So hopefully I can be funny with you today a little bit, you know.
Great. That's not a
All
problem
right.
at all. But so how long have you been living in Moscow now?
Since the end of 2006, so roughly 13 years. So I definitely know the terrain. And the best part about it, of being here that long, is that I can actually remember a very different Russia that used to be. Of course, I was not here during the 90s when Russia was even more different than back then. So it's
Yeah.
definitely, things have changed a lot since the moment of my birth. I was born in 1981. And that Russia is a completely different universe from the one that there is today.
Absolutely. So let me ask you personally, what do you miss most about America? And does
Oh.
anything in Moscow make up for it or substitute?
Definitely. I'm a big fan of guns. I like my gun culture, so I'm the American stereotype, which will aggravate probably some of our British or Australian listeners. They seem to be very passionate against that, but it's easier here. You could still go use guns, and eventually, and I have citizenship now, so as soon as I have the money, I'd like to actually buy one. I love destroying paper plates and bottles. It is my passion. That's one thing that's easier. Any sort of hobby, for some reason, is any easier. Russians tend to take things very, very seriously, even if it's a hobby. So it doesn't matter. Let's pick a hobby I don't do, like tennis. If you show up to that tennis club or whatever, and your racket is not perfect, your shorts are not specifically tennis shorts, your shoes are, you bought basketball shoes, you're out. You're just a freak. You're not taking it seriously. So in some ways, any sort of hobby is a lot more relaxed. Of course, I'm from Ohio, not from California, so the whole gun thing is another thing. Guns are easier to get here than they are in California, by the way. So it really depends on the state, the gun attitudes. Then obviously, I miss my parents, who are not here. And driving in America is much more pleasant. Note again, I am not from New York or Los Angeles, so the part of America that I'm in has much, much more pleasant driving than it does in Russia as a whole. So those kind of things, I guess. But yeah, but they weren't enough to drag me back. At least
Yeah,
not
yeah.
yet. So.
I've never been to Russia, but I passed through. So I mean, so technically I was. I
Mhm.
passed through Moscow in 1999 or 98. Right?
Yeah.
And so I can't say I saw Russia, but certainly
Hmm.
from the people I saw in the airport, it did seem I could tell a culture difference. A lot more somber and yeah. I don't know if depressed is the right word. I don't want to be insulting, but I did
Well,
get that kind of vibe. You know?
oh, those were a bit of tough times. I can say that
Yeah,
much.
they were. They
I mean,
actually were.
but the thing is, you're right, because the one thing is, it does take time to sort of soak in the culture, no matter where you go. They say that there's a 2 to 3 week period where people tend to have a different view of things. They sort of settle into it. They sort of notice more the reality after that period. The honeymoon phase is over or something. And I would say that also applies to Russia or anywhere. But yeah, and also like my one biggest regret is that I worked in Thailand for half a year, but I had to work so much, 6 days a week, long hours, that
Yeah.
I don't know anything in their language except like cup means okay or let's do it or let's go or something. So that was kind of thing where I got to finally become that expat guy. Because with Russia, I'm an immigrant. I came here to learn, to get in the culture, but I have had that expat experience in Thailand where it's like, I like you people, but I'm not, I'm Slavic, so my ancestors kind of came from here. But I'm not Thai. I don't know anything, and I don't have
Yeah.
any time to learn. And so I actually did have that expat experience. And being an expat's not so great. Being an immigrant was much more enjoyable. Being part of the team, so to say.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Now, because we're speaking in English, so it's going to be an English-speaking audience, which means
Yeah.
basically Western. So obviously, because of the huge psychological warfare that's going on, it has to be plainly stated in those terms.
Yeah.
All the sort of Russia things
Yeah.
will be in people's heads, right? And so let's just address that first off, and then we'll get to the other thing. I mean, you personally have been called a Russian propagandist.
Yeah.
You're labeled as a questionable source, but I can't remember the website, some media fact checking, whatever. And then, and there's this whole insane labeling, by liberals in particular, of, anybody who criticizes the power wielders in Western establishment, they're called Russian bots, Russian spies, Russian agents, Russian assets. I will probably be called one too just by talking to you.
Oh,
But
that's actually very possible.
how do
Yes.
you feel about this?
Oh, well, it's sort of I think, a natural reaction. This is one thing that's very unfortunate. The average person on our planet, maybe some of the people listening now, are really unable to understand that someone can look at things reasonably. Basically, we're human beings have a tribal mentality, right? There's our tribe, there's the enemy tribe, and it's this tribal mentality that really affects politics, even affects baseball and American football, where this is our team, these are our guys, they're the good guys, and that's the other side. For example, something insane that happened recently is this professor who's also a historical enactor brutally murdered his much, much, much younger wife in Russia. And that's become a scandal because it's very visual, because they have all these pictures where he's dressed up in a Napoleonic gear and all that stuff, right? Okay. Now, there's actually a small movement, even though they have a lot of video evidence. I think he may have admitted to it on camera. Don't quote me on that about sources. I think he actually admitted to doing the crime, but claims that she started it or something. They have video footage of it. Anyways, it's pretty open and shut case. But there's still a movement to save him because he's their guy. Just the same thing like with you see in politics, where especially the Democrats, more so of American politics, excuse me, let's be clear. They always talk about, there's gender and race and women are oppressed and we need more representation. Okay, why not that Tulsi Gabbard woman? But that's not the right kind. We need Joe Biden now, because so basically when it comes to this whole thing, someone being their guy, being our guy, even in supposedly people who live in a scientific, rational age in the post-Enlightenment West, they still think that way. Unfortunately, we humans are tribal, and that's another reason why we're never going to have this utopian moment. I was just telling someone this the other day. He criticized one of my works, which is fine. He did it very nicely with no swear words. But he was saying, we don't deserve to go to Mars or extend out to leave Earth until we get our things in order and create justice and fairness for all. Never going to happen. Unfortunately, we all of our humans were flawed, and there's always going to be hatred. There's always going to be tribalism.
And if
it's the way we are.
Sorry. If I might interject, I would bet. I don't know who the guy you're talking about is. I would bet that guy would be a classic expat if he ever went into a developing country. You know what I mean?
That's very much so. Yes.
These type of liberals, it's so. I was actually, just to give you a little background, I was born in the States. I was raised in Canada, but I decided
Well, yes, I was going to ask, you don't have any accent whatsoever. I was like, I thought in Trinidad there was a bit of an accent. But anyway.
Yeah.
Go on, sorry. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. And I came back in 1990. I left there. So there's a bit of I can sympathize a lot with you going to your Russian roots. And it was a similar thing for me. And and so I know this kind of whole expat thing well, and these liberals coming, and I heard you mention it, and so they are fooling themselves because they are not fooling the people they're pretending to save. I just wanted to add that for
and also a lot of times they don't quite understand them. You know what I mean? Because if we talk to some sort of coffee drinking Russian liberal in the center of Moscow, they're going to say that they live in some sort of totalitarian nightmare state, whereas I could tell you, well, you can come here and look. I mean, just go around. There's no totalitarian nightmare state, but not because of some sort of higher intellectual, like libertarian something, but because no one cares. That's why I call Russia has accidental libertarianism, because a Western libertarian believes in some sort of like non-aggression, where I'm not going to be aggressive towards you, you're not going to be aggressive towards me. Good luck organizing that. Yeah. But here it's more just like in Russia, there's this sort of, I don't know, it's not, maybe apathy might be the right word, but this sort of people don't really care what you do or what you say. There's basically the taboos in Russia are much smaller. I would say one thing, specifically insulting a powerful person by name doesn't go over well in Russian society. However, insulting someone by class goes together well. A good example of this would be in the Soviet period. There is a movie. What is it called? Oh, I can't remember. I think it's something called like 5 Minutes to Midnight. Well, there's a song in it that's 5 minutes to midnight in translation. So we'll stick with that, right? And there's sort of a character that represents the typical bureaucrat. And this is during, I think Stalin was even alive during that time. So you have a very high censorship, but they were really insulting all of Soviet power and this generic bureaucrat guy, not
Yeah.
so much one specific person. So there is, to a degree, there's taboo everywhere. That's another
Yeah.
thing. That's very nice people. It's just different what the taboos are. So there
Right.
are some here, but I would say they're more light and they're sort of easier to avoid. You don't insult the big leader. You don't insult certain people by name. And Russia's like sort of historical mission, like in, for example, the sacrifices made to fight Nazi Germany. Boy, that's a bad position to have if you think the Soviet Union were one of the bad guys in World War II. That is not going to win you many friends here. But other than that, I mean, there's not a lot. Whereas now, when we get into the West, everyone is just terrified to open their mouths, and even reasonable opinions, of stuff like boys prefer sports. Heavy emphasis on the word prefer, because we're sort of trapped in this thinking that we're still back in the 1900s. Because back in the old days, it was true. People would be like, no, girls cannot participate in baseball. This is forbidden. Now we've opened the door. Everyone can, but most women don't, So we're getting in this thing where, again, I'm going to go in a circle here, but so in some ways in Russia, you have more freedom because the political correctness here is much more reduced, and the things that it involves are a lot easier to avoid, especially if you're just some average person on the street. But people in the center of Moscow, these sort of activist types, are sure that they're repressed while they're able to freely discuss everything they want and make plans for marches. The marches get approved by the government, but they're oppressed because they have a total different worry, or a different concern. When you go outside of Moscow, when you see the average people, well, what are they concerned about? They want a nice place to live. They want a nice vacation. They want a decent salary. What do they like about the West? They don't care anything about us mentally or spiritually or anything. All they want is our stuff. They perceive that people in the West have nice stuff. They want the stuff. And most Russians, this would surprise people. Russians are so, I would say, actually not particularly ideological. Whatever system gives them the 2 vacations and stability, financial stability, and that. And it's a system where they feel respected as individuals. Good. Who cares what it is? Who cares? Doesn't matter. Yeah. So it's much different, where I think in the West, a lot of people are very, especially right now, it's becoming, again, socialism versus capitalism. People here, ironically, don't care. Whichever one gives me a decent life, let it be, brother. So there you go.
Yeah, I think that's true for many places in the world. It's very true, I think, for, the West Indies. It's true for a lot of Asia. This sort of ideological crusading and purity, perhaps it was big in the Soviet Union time, I guess, but it's generally a Western thing, and it's especially a university educated thing, right? So that's where a lot of the divide, I think, the cultural clash in the United States, in Britain, in the West, is between those university educated people who are stuffed, their heads are stuffed with all sorts of almost anti-natural
well, yeah, and a lot of this, a lot of those people who would actually start to talk about class, it's sort of a class thing because, for example, even though I'm someone that does work in ideology, I have to fundamentally make my money on entertainment and humor. Okay, I would prefer to be just some sort of ideologue who sits around and analyzes meaning and passes them around. I don't have the opportunity to do that, so I'm tied to the land, right? Okay. My father, for example, has worked with his hands his entire life. If you don't show up to a job, especially in America, to paint or saw something or finish furniture, you're done. You're fired. Your life is over. So that you have to understand that. I'd like the audience to understand that a lot of activists are professional activists, or they come from some part of society where they're bourgeois enough that they have the time to do this. They have the time to sit around and complain and whine and all that. And what's happening now, why we're entering a very democratic 21st century. I actually just wrote an open letter to Pat Buchanan about this. Hopefully he'll answer. But I was telling him is that we need, the main problem is that the majority, everywhere, in all countries, the majority, the heartlanders, the people who really contribute to the economy, who have the kids that create the future of that culture, the world over, be it Russia, China, India, Africa, or wherever, have no voice because we're busy and we're tired. And it's urbanite, upper middle class, sometimes the upper class, who are pushing for everything. I mean, look at Hollywood. Look at their moral preaching. Look at their perception of reality and what I should do as a Midwesterner. Guys, I'm sorry, Midwesterners work themselves to death, get fat, get heart disease, die young because we're forced into this rhythm. And you're telling us about some sort of gender oppression. It has nothing to do with anything. Midwestern Americans want a job and they want to work no more than 8 hours a day. Give us a break. We want to live at least a little bit.
Let me ask you something about that, because it's interesting. I'm also a trained anthropologist as well. So all these cultural things, and because I live interculturally, all this stuff is interesting. Telling jokes are extremely embedded within a culture, and they often don't translate well.
Yeah.
So how you operate in the Russian language, is that correct?
Well, yeah. Well, I go on the radio in the mornings, so there's sort of a morning.
And your jokes are in Russian?
Yeah, but remember, I'm sort of the support guy. I guess the most famous radio show in the world ever was the Howard Stern show. So Howard was the main guy who does all the talking, and then he had some supporting people like the Robin and who was the sound guy? I think there was a sound guy, and then maybe I had more like that sort of third guy who jumps in, because it's usually myself.
Marty or something.
I want to say Fred, but maybe that wasn't Fred.
Artie was in something like that.
Jackie the Joke Man Martin, maybe that guy.
Right.
So so sort of Howard is this main guy. He's the real voice of the show, and then you have someone who jumps in, and I'm usually the guy who sort of jumps in. But I'll tell you one thing: that a lot of the time,
you're kind of a straight man.
I'm the foreign guy. Remember, I have an accent, so anyone who's a foreigner always sounds a little bit dumb or naive. So you kind of have to play to that. Or the thing is, sometimes I'm sort of the one who brings in the harsh reality. But the thing is that I'm pretty good with doing puns, even in a foreign language. Or and also, I'll tell you one thing: sex is the easiest form of humor, and that's why sex is such a big part of humor. There's something, if you think about. The way that you're dealing with me now, the way that you go to the store, the way that you, I don't know, all of your interactions in life, but there's certain primal things that are just bizarre that we do that are like defecating. We found a way to make that classy. We hide it. We have toilet paper. We have toilets. We've modernized it, and it's hidden. We have eating, which in every culture, there's different rules. But from Japanese people, I've heard if they feel like they have to open their mouth while eating, they immediately cover it for rudeness. Americans, we have knife and fork because it looks classy. But with sex, there's sort of no way to de-animalize it, and I think there's something very weird about it. So any sort of sex joke always works. And especially there are certain themes associated with foreigners. Spying, America versus Russia. So to be honest, sometimes when people get too hyped up over Russia, I can always say as an American, it's like, well, who's got the biggest economy in the world, fellas? Or something like that. Something kind of shut them down or something. Or I'll bring democracy to you. It's hard to explain. It's hard to explain a joke. You just sort of have to be in the moment and do it. But, and then sometimes I play more the Russian side or anything or,
And I guess your Slavic background gives you a sensibility, would you say?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And also, one thing on the radio show, one time someone noticed something, and he called it Good Morning Russia without Russians, because the main host is an ethnic Finn. The sound guy is a Jew. I am from America. And the other guy who doesn't come around too much, who's actually the boss, is Tajik. So, Good Morning Russia without Russians. But, sometimes you can get sort of typecast, but you got to roll with your typecast, I guess.
Sure. Well, why don't you tell us the story of how you ended up in Russia? I know you've told it a million times, but at least
that's all right.
Briefly.
Well, it's sometimes nice to do it in English instead of Russian, but I wrote a whole book about it in Russian. Unfortunately, there's no translation. If anyone's a publisher out there and you're willing to pay me money for it and buy the rights to it, knock yourself out, because I'm not going to translate it. That's way too much work. But anyways, so the book actually sold thousands of copies, electronic copies anyway, so that was nice.
Yeah.
I didn't really get anything out of it, but whatever.
What's the Russian title?
The Russian title is "Почему Россия, мой переезд из Get в Америке в Хрущевку в Москве." It's very long. It is Why Russia? My journey from the American ghetto to the Russian Khrushchevka. Now, the thing is, there's a little bit of humor in that, because it associates going from a crappy point A to a crappy point B. Khrushchevki are the terribly made, nasty Khrushchev-era apartments that every Russian would like to not live in. So it
Right.
sort of says it goes from basically from one terrible situation to a different terrible situation.
Yeah.
That's the implication there. Some people like it, some people don't. But basically, I heard from everyone that they're like, you can't just make a book called "Why Russia." It has to have some sort of sub headline.
Yeah.
There's got to be a subheader, or it's going to fail. So I maybe that's too much. It's very wordy, but whatever. So anyways, in that book, I also give America a very fair shake, because one of the problems I noticed when you're writing a book, if you're writing a book about why you got divorced, you are going to focus on everything about your ex-wife that is maybe the worst about her, and not so much the best, right? So I try to give America a fair shake. And to be honest, one thing that did happen and change is my parents left Cleveland, Ohio. I love the Cleveland Browns. I like the Cleveland sports teams. I like the people, some people there. I had a lot of terrible experiences in Cleveland. I don't like being there. If I had the chance to drive around it and not through it, I would. But anyways, my parents left to go live in the middle of nowhere, and it's a lot nicer. And even in the book, I write that if I were to have grown up in the middle of nowhere with my parents, I probably would have had different life experiences, and maybe I never would have left. Although I did have this big wanderlust when I was younger. Still kind of do today. But I don't know, I maybe would have never left. Anyways, now that big preface is out of the way, I'll tell you that, as I got older, my ancestry became very important because I got stuck between two worlds, okay? So I'm from a majority African-American city and definitely a majority African-American sort of a district subdivision of it, right?
Okay.
Yeah, and so basically your whole life, you're reminded that you are a minority and you are not well liked. But on the other hand, that's the culture I grew up in, and that's the culture that sort of makes sense to me, because although at home mom and dad are American, white American, I should say, black people are obviously American. I was sort of more raised by the culture around you. You'll even notice that with children with their accents. Mom and dad might speak a language, but it's the culture they grew up in that determines their primary native language. Anyways, I sort of got stuck in this weird sort of paradox between, I was growing up in this one African-American way of thinking and system and reasoning, but then I'm a white guy, and in that system I'm kind of the enemy. But also when I go around a lot of white American people, it's just like, I'm sure maybe you've noticed there's a really, there's this way of talking that we have to talk with each other and be as absolutely
SWPL stuff, right?
Yeah,
stuff
it's very SJW. Like. And to be honest, with all the black people that I know from when I grew up, right, and we're still on my Facebook, generally no problems, no agreement. It's with the white people. Especially, I was in the Peace Corps, which is a very liberal organization. Yeah. There's maybe two people out of that, my group of Peace Corps volunteers that I agree with. And, all of them are just like, if it wasn't for white imperialism and this and this and that and all this, it's like, it's just very, very hard to deal with. Especially the whole white picket fences. Everything has to be perfect, always smiling, that part of America. Yeah. So culturally, I found myself in this very, African-American mindset, although obviously I certainly don't look it. But the problem is you're the enemy. Not to everyone, obviously. I have plenty of people on Facebook who I went to high school with who don't consider me the enemy, right? But the problem is what happens with racism is it's not the 90%, might not even be the 95%. It's that 10 or 5% of people who are very, very ideological against you. And it makes living in Cleveland made it very hard. Because, like I said, you're always the enemy, and everything's a fight. So I can really maybe not to the same degree because it was never legally, but I could sort of relate to this whole sort of Rosa Parks feeling because literally on the bus it was sort of the opposite. Whereas in the segregation period, black people were forced to the back of the bus because it's theoretically worse. Well, even when I went to school, it was like, you're white and you go sit in the back of the bus, you're in deep trouble. However, one time I actually did get sort of fired up, and I was like, let's see what happens. And I sort of sat down and put my arms around two guys at the very back of the bus, like, guys, how are we doing today? So I sort of had my Rosa Parks moment once in my life. They didn't do anything, though. But then again, I have to be honest, it wasn't the day that the biggest guys were on the bus. Yeah. And I'm a pretty big dude, so I was like, well, these two guys are pansies. Oh, I'll deal with them if they stand up. But you know what I mean? So that was the one thing. So you kind of have this moment where you're like, obviously I can't be allowed in Black American society. And white American society, I guess I could be allowed into it, but I find it repulsive and I don't really want to. Yeah. But this is about the time I'm 18. Obviously, when I was younger, I didn't really understand these things. So then you're kind of like, I got to be somebody. And that's like, oh, well, all my ancestors came from Eastern Europe. Despite the fact that I have this very English-sounding name, I'm 0% English. All my ancestors came from Eastern Europe, and at one time when there
So
was
where
Russian
did
Empire,
Kirby come from?
that's because apparently my great-grandfather during World War One, he was drafted, but he had to go fight on the German side. He didn't like it, wasn't interested in that, so he stole the documentation of a Polish person who wasn't involved in the war named Kijanski, or Kajansky, as we'd say in America, and he came to America as Kajansky, and then he got worried that someone might find out or it might be some sort of consequences, so they changed it to something with K that sounds very American, which is how that happened. Of course, that story, that again about someone criticizing me for fact-checking, that is a story that was told orally through the generations. But I'll tell you the basic fact. Had to fight in World War I, didn't want to fight. Name didn't sound Polish, was afraid to go to America with German-sounding name after already 1916 happened or whatever, and so changed it to something Polish because no one would suspect. But no one in my ancestry speaks any sort of language like German or French or Italian or anything. They were all hardcore Slavic people. So so that's it. So it's kind of a
you were fitting in. You just felt isolated, not in a community in America, kind of that you could feel comfortable in. So you wanted to just find someplace else. Is that it?
Yeah, and especially the whole thing about which we've seen the rise of in America during especially my generation is the forced feminization, especially because that's the one thing why I always envied a lot of the black students in my school, because they could be as macho and masculine as they want. Whereas if you're a guy, it's really forcing you be nice, be feminine, all that other stuff, dude. Drives me nuts. And it's only getting worse, and I really feel bad for a lot of young men right now because they're being, well, I was told absolutely the wrong things about life and about women and about your function and everything you think and feel. And I think a lot of young men are being forced into this ideological prison where they're told to feel terrible about themselves for what they are, which isn't very good. Because again, I'm a big advocate. Self-hatred will destroy you, and you'll see it everywhere. I have heard basically these big circles of self-hatred, if I can remember the circle. I met Swedish people who said that Swedes envy Mexicans because Mexicans are expressive and can dance and they hate themselves. But then I'm sure there are people in Mexico who are like, oh, but people in this other country, they have more money than they are. They're better than us. Or people in America all want to get tan because tan is cool, whereas people in Thailand, where I was, will spend any amount of money to whiten themselves to be white. There's this constant feeling of inferiority. Stop the inferiority. If you're black, you're fantastic for being black. You're Chinese, that's fantastic. Your culture's 5,000 years old. You're Indian, your culture's also 5,000 years old. You're ancient, you're great. Whatever you want, just sort of accept it and stop hating yourself. That's basically it. But don't tell me that I'm bad for being Slavic or masculine or whatever. That's the difference between me and the SJWs. They want you to love yourself. If you're the right kind of person we like, you're allowed to love yourself. Based on some sort of what's that called? Intersectional hierarchy. That stuff's out. If you're Indian, love yourself for being Indian. Don't try to change my religion or my way of doing things over here. And that works out for me.
And quite interestingly, if I'm where you talked about tribalism, I've certainly observed that about liberals. Liberals are a definite tribe. That's why they hated Sarah Palin, for example. She was a woman, broke barriers, did everything that, a feminist, I guess, is supposed to do, but they hated her. She didn't go to the right schools, her accent, where she lives, she had all these children, it was like, she was just, what she read, she was just not, she didn't have the tribal markers. She was of a different tribe.
And everyone was fine with Donald Trump until he ran for office. As being a billionaire. There's plenty of photos of him at all sorts of parties where everyone's smiling and hugging him, who would now never be seen in the same room as he is. There's definitely, that's a huge obvious thing with it. Of course, it's not just the liberals, but just recently they seem to be the ones who are more flagrant with it because they set these high standards again for diversity. But then, for
example, the thing is that they explicitly try to say they're not tribal. They have this ideology that says they're against tribalism, but they're perhaps the most cliquish which is what a
Yeah.
tribe is. They are the most cliquish set of people out, you know?
Oh, well, yeah, that's kind of one of these things where I think we're going to go through my entire life's work of philosophical concepts here, because here comes another one. I was at a conference, and a man next to me, Andrei Afanasyev. Hi, Andrei, if you're listening. Great guy, one of the most hardworking and brilliant men I've ever met. He was in a debate with a Russian liberal about objectivity. Is there objectivity in the media and all that? And so Andrei says, no. Unfortunately, objectivity is impossible. There's no way to express thoughts in a completely neutral way. However, we should understand this, and objectivity should be our goal. We need to stop, think, and try to find a way to make sure that what we're projecting isn't stupid, dumb propaganda, but maintains a certain level of objectivity. But obviously, the best thing would be is to have various different sources trying their best to be objective and giving people different views on a single situation. That'd be awesome. So the Russian liberal comes up and goes, objectivity exists. I have it. You don't. Do you see the difference?
Exactly.
So that's another thing, is when you can admit to that, objectivity isn't here, but it's a goal we should strive for. Let's go for it. That's it. Whereas when you're someone who's so arrogant as to say, I am objective, and because you disagree with me,
it's
you're
a lack of humility.
It's a lack of humility. It is a horrible arrogance. Yeah. Well, of course, the Republicans can be that way too. I don't want to jump too much just on the Democrats here, but that's something you're definitely seeing. So basically, any value that you have to strive for, you need to sort of check yourself, have a little bit of humility. Just like I try to strive to be a reasoned individual when I present a lot of these arguments that I make, but all human beings.
I like to say that
I just want to jump in. All human beings. Kind of lost you there. All human beings are irrational and emotional. I have emotions. I can sometimes catch myself being irrational. I may tell you that, yes, trying to be reasoned, really thinking out your positions is the way to go. I will fail at that, but I know it's the right thing to do. So that's, another way of set a goal, understand that you'll never achieve that goal like some sort of utopian goal, but strive for it, and the people who are like the hardcore liberals don't do that.
Fair.
Yeah.
And it's like, try to be fair. I think that's the thing. Be humble, and try to be fair. That is part of it. Now, so this is interesting. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, from looking at when you got to Russia, I know there was a Kazakhstan included and stuff like that, and I think that was a Peace Corps episode you were talking about. But you didn't immediately become a political analyst. No. It was like your comedy kind of work. So how did, and you became very popular with your comedy.
The first thing I did is actually I worked in the computer and video game industry. I did that for a few years. Well, the thing is, my degree was in graphic design actually, and so I kind of I'll put it this way. This is a good story because it's something more less hardcore, less intellectual. So you're a young guy. What was I, 24? And I started talking. That was back in the MySpace days. So I started talking to this girl over MySpace, and she had curly hair, and she was really good.
24?
Yeah, I was 24 at the time.
Oh, you were 24, right?
I was 24. Great, yeah. And back then, MySpace was still a thing. And so this girl started talking to me over MySpace because she noticed I was in Moscow, and she had this absolutely gorgeous, curly, dark hair, and she was in very good shape, lovely smile. I was like, wow, all right. She wants to meet up. Let's do this thing. So I meet up with her at a public area, sort of. And anyways, after a while, she looks over her shoulder and goes, "Oh, hi, that's my boyfriend coming." I'm like, "Oh, what the F is this?" And I'm thinking, man, this guy, he is going to be on fire. But on the opposite, quite the opposite happened. He was full of smiles, got to know me, and he was like, "Oh, so you do graphic design? We need a graphic designer." And that's how that all happened. And then I made video games for a few years. Of course, the company I worked for got sold here, holding this, sold there. So it's kind of hard to exactly give it one name where I was actually working, but it was all over the place.
Yeah.
And from there, I started to do videos on YouTube. But back then, I was a little bit more of a simpleton, more raunchy, more angry video game nerd meets political stuff. And some of the videos went viral. Never made a dime off of any of those videos, just so people know. And from there, I sort of got noticed in the media, and I got invited to talk to people at RT to do something informative yet funny. And then I also, at the same time, got offered to go on the radio because they wanted like I don't know, for example, like for an English, it'd be like crazy foreign guy or something, I
Yeah.
don't know, whatever.
So on RT, you were doing a kind of like a funny documentary, non-fic kind of thing. Is that what it was?
Well, the first thing I did. One thing is about the inner workings of RT. Unfortunately, they made us sign a non-disclosure agreement, so the inner workings are not on the table. But
Yeah.
at the time, it was something called. I did something that was more silly called "Why You Should Care," basically
Right.
because I wanted to talk about certain topics and show how they're mental. So I thought,
Yeah.
okay, how am I going to do this? So essentially, I created this robot character who is the most default generic. Today, we would call him the NPC meme, like
Yeah.
this stock worldview, which changes depending on the situation. You know what I mean?
That's right.
But
Yeah.
so the sort of the opportunity that I created this monster. I was the creator of him to do this show, and so we sort of bounced ideas back and forth with the robot. It's called Why You Should Care. I don't think it's ever been taken down. It should be still up there. I was much thinner back then. I look nice in the suit. And then I also did a segment called Just My Opinion, where I sort of just kind of would come up and between the commercial breaks drop like 2 minutes of truth bombs on the world. I was called by some publication Russia Today's Joe the Plumber. I always thought I
Okay.
was more of Russia Today's Glenn Beck, which I was kind of hoping to become. I really wish that would have happened. I would love to be doing like a radio show or something like that for RT, but that didn't play out,
Yeah.
sadly. But so I was sort of their Joe the Plumber, according to some big media outlets, and so I did that for a while. But now I was moved over. Then I was moved over to work in RT in Russian because I'm a lot more popular and famous, and I'd say influential in Russia than I am in English. In Russian, I forgot
Yeah.
the end there, and then in English, and then after that, there was a bit of a change of who was the boss in the Russian division, and I can only guess that coincided with their desire to send me over to do tourism-related things, which are fun. And I got no complaints, but so I am on the the outer edge of the organization now. We do tourism stuff, so technically that makes me independent because I don't do anything political for them anymore.
Right. So your move to Russia was not really like politically motivated, or it sounds like very like
Mhm.
like everyday sort of like so. Yeah, it doesn't sound political. Yeah, I mean
Yeah,
you're just a guy doing stuff, computers, and then you got into the media,
yeah.
and so that's interesting. But you got into a kind of, I mean, you're doing some pretty heavy stuff, talking about
Yeah,
like fourth political theory and stuff like that, Dugin, and I mean
yeah.
that's so.
Well,
So how did you make the transition to that? Were you political in America at all, or was it like in Russia that you became politically
oh,
minded?
gosh, how can I put this in some form that won't sound arrogant or smug? Hold on. Ah, I'll put it this way. I'm a poor man from a poor, depressed place where people don't think much, but I always
Yeah.
wanted to think. You see what I mean? It's one of
Yeah.
those things where it's something I always wanted to do.
Yeah.
And maybe it worked out because in a lot of ways, what makes me different is I come from the background of being absolutely dirt poor, work with your hands, that kind of
Yeah.
stuff kind of guy. But I'm also intellectual. Whereas, most intellectuals tend to be, even intellectuals I agree with, kind of feminine, kind of, even if I
Yeah.
agree with them, they're in their Starbucks cafe
That's
world
right.
and stuff. So I think that I always had the deep desire to do it, but it was very much hard to do. And that's going back to, you asked things I really like doing in America. Well, I'll tell you one thing: when you're in the Midwest, I'm sorry, Midwest Rust Belt, but boy, conversations can often be shallow. I mean, like when
Yeah.
my parents moved, there's one farmer who I occasionally talk to. He's got things to think
Yeah.
about. But the thing is, I think it's because he's 78. He's from a different,
Yeah. Yeah.
universe or
Yeah. Yeah.
whatever. I think he said he was 78. Well, he's definitely up there. He's retirement age, for sure. But besides that one farmer guy, not a lot of intellectual stuff. And that's also one kind of thing that sort of motivated me to move over, because I think we all need, or at least maybe I shouldn't say we all, I need a balance. I need my physical stuff. I need to beat some hammers and nails and drink some beer and shoot some clay pigeons, but I also need intellectual pursuits and all that.
Yeah.
So, and in Russia you can have that. You can be as macho manly as you want and whatever, but you can also be highly intellectual. So that's one thing where it's very comfortable to live here, even though, like salaries in Russia aren't exactly that great. And sometimes, you're, because even in America being poor, no, we did have some tough times. But if you're middle class in America, you're not going to think, oh, man, I'm going to have to wait for my next salary to get boots. Whereas, like, right now, I'm like, come on, salary, let's get them damn boots. It's getting cold, So it's that's definitely a minus of Russia, but yeah.
So what was your first sort of foray into political analysis? I guess it might have been there in some of your other work, but like, what was your first, really, this is political first and foremost?
Well, it goes back to the whole YouTube thing. So what happened is I started working in this company, doing interface design. And you're a young guy, or I mean, you as in me at the time. I was a young guy, the figurative you. And at the time, what do young men want? They want to meet girls. And, I wanted to get married and have kids. But, of course, wanted to meet a lot of girls first, make sure, try a lot out before I bought, excuse me. But so that was kind of my mission there, right? So I went on a lot of first dates. I mean, you're talking a lot of first dates. I think more than half my salary went on these first dates at the time. But so anyways, I started to notice these cyclical conversations where every conversation with these girls was the same. It was sort of this like, well, but you're from America. How can you live here? It's so awful here. There's so much money there. You have a big house. No, I don't have anything in America. Yeah. But, basically that implied that there's so much money there and this, that, and the other. And but you have freedom. We don't. And you have this and we don't. Yeah. And so I got confronted by this every day of my life for maybe 3 to 4 months. And I just kind of snapped and I was like, but that's not true. The American economy is much bigger. The average American income is higher. No one is going to debate that. But does the average American live some sort of privileged life of gold where, it's like, oh, 2 cars in a house, no worries, no bills, whatever, everything's going to be, no. Okay? So I just tried to start setting people straight, and this desire to set people straight sort of expanded my mind into other things. And again, back then when I had more free time, a lot of people started to introduce me to Russian intellectual thinkers, including Dugin at the time. And then when I had the radio show, the opportunity to start a radio show, this was before the Morning Zoo, I sort of did one that was a bit political. And they were just like, I think because thankfully the boss at the radio, he's willing to try stuff. And I think that was mental to have a foreign person go on and do a radio show on. So I was able to basically all these Russian intellectuals kind of all got a chance to go on the radio that they normally didn't get. And I was pretty nuts. And I won basically the equivalent of a radio Grammy. What's the radio award called? I'm sure there is one. But for like best radio political talk show. I can't
remember, yeah.
But so anyways, I have a big fat bronze trophy or whatever somewhere. Yeah. So anyways, it was really cool and it went really well. And then they moved me over to the Morning Zoo, which for them was considered a promotion. And so that's why it was sort of a transformation from myth busting into me sort of realizing like, hey, I can be more than a design monkey. Right, I can do more here than just because in a lot of ways, when you're from the Midwest and you're from a poor city, especially from a black neighborhood, which is really sad, you get this pessimistic, hopeless attitude, which Russians also have. So, I heard so many times growing up, they're never going to let a black man succeed in this world. They're never going to let a black man, I might as well just sell weed because they're never going to let me succeed. And you hear this over and over and over again. But the thing is, I believed in that too, because you just sort of see, not so much the black part because I'm not, but I definitely was in that mindset of it's like, I'm some poor schlub from the Midwest. I'm never going to get anywhere. I'm never going to do anything. So that's why I chose graphic design, because it's creative, but it's practical. It's something you need. Yeah. It's something you can do with your hands. And I was like, well, you know what? If I get a degree in this, I know I'm going to be able to do it somewhere for the rest of my life. And also, I used to work at a delivering ventilation and gas and all that stuff. And when you're on a job site and you see guys who are like doing, physical labor, general labor especially, and they're 60 years old, you're like, that's for the birds. Guys who are bald and losing their teeth with white hair, and they're still hauling gas cans like I am at 18. Exactly. They're like, no, I'll do graphic design. So graphic design wasn't exactly my passion. It was a practical choice. But that was a very like Cleveland ghetto choice of,
right.
Feudal serf, like, well, I better do what I can to serve massa and make enough bread to get by to tomorrow. That was sort of my reasoning at the time, which is very pathetic, very slavish. But that's the way I sort of thought at the time. And the thing is, though, when you go around Russia, that slavish mentality is here everywhere, my friend. That sort of serfdom, serfish? Yeah. I don't know what the word would be, the adjective. Yeah. But this like a medieval serf, where everything's bad, everything's horrible. I should just do what I can to get by. And that's where the whole Russian corruption thing comes in. It's very tied into that. Whereas in Cleveland, it was this whole thing of, they're never going to let me succeed as a black man, so I have the right to steal something or sell drugs or whatever. That sort of extreme. The Russian extreme is, I'm never going to be able to make an honest living, so I can steal as much as I want. From corruption. The only difference is that in Russia, there's a very, very big stigma about like violent crime. Violent crime is considered like that's so animal and low brow. Now, corruption, where you're stealing with your mind, that's the gold standard there. That means you're smart. Yes. So unfortunately, Russians in a lot of ways are actually very con artisty. A lot of con artists here. A lot of them. So
in Trinidadians, unfortunately, are known throughout the Caribbean as Trickydadians. It sounds very similar. Very similar. Trickydadians.
Trickydadians. Yeah.
Yes, for the same reasons. Yeah.
Well, that's the one thing. Well, we can say where I think the white Americans maybe do have a little bit of intellectual privilege is that because I tell people in Russia, well, why are Americans so patriotic? Well, I can tell you one thing. A lot of people came from Europe from bad situations. The Huguenots who were repressed, or other Catholics in a Protestant country, Protestants in a Catholic country, people who were running away from wars, or people who left for all these various different reasons. They all came to America, and more or less their standard of living pretty much did go up. So that's why one thing where I can see why with this white American culture, if you work hard, you can do anything, because they saw that happen with their ancestors. Whereas when you get to maybe people in Trinidad, because it's I'm presuming with stereotypes that island lifestyle. There's the island, there's the sun, there's the sea. Everything's the same every day. There's kind of enough food if you're willing to go get it from the sea. So whatever, who cares? Black America was forced, unfortunately, into this hundreds of years of slavery. And obviously with slavery, you don't work hard. You work the bare minimum to get by and not get punished or, God forbid, shot. And in Russia, in a lot of ways, people do work hard for themselves. That's something that sort of evolved in Russia, this mentality why communism here was maybe not the best choice to do it here is, definitely you could see the difference. A Russian guy works for himself, works for someone else, F you. Because Russia is very sort of tribal or something. And there was also serfdom, where with serfdom, you did want to work and you did get to keep most of what you kept. But at the same time, you have like 6 months of winter where you have nothing to do. So, you can do it tomorrow. There's a big thing with that.
It's very interesting culturally what you're saying there, because I identify with it a lot here. It sounds really like I know it's not exactly the same, but there seem to be a lot of very similar characteristics. But I'm interested in your your political theory and your political work and your theoretical stuff. In terms of, because you're doing some very, very interesting critiques of liberalism, of geopolitics, and this kind of stuff. Now, how do you see that within your personal project? Because on the other hand, you are, you have your radio show, you're doing your comedy. Do you see yourself as like having a political mission primarily, or not really? How do you?
I would say it's definitely political. That's more, I think, the thing that I can do better than other people, and I think that there's more value in that. I mean, there's a lot of people who can make jokes about gay parades in around the world and sex and all that stuff. Ha ha he he. You know
Yeah,
what? How much brains does it take to tell Russians, blah, blah, blah? Oh, some two guys are kissing. Oh, that's gross. Ha ha. You know, that's not
yeah,
that funny. Not that the whole gay thing is the only thing we joke about. We joke about everything. What I'm saying is that there's plenty of people who can do that, but there's
yeah,
very
yeah,
few
yeah.
people. I guess I'll toot my own horn here. I seem to be able to break down complex things and put them in a simple way, and I think that that's probably my main contribution to society. Also, I can sort of keep my emotions under control because even sometimes some very intelligent people, very good political analysts, I can see them fall into the trap where here comes their feelings and here comes
Yeah.
the tribalism, and they're losing their objectivity. So I would say it's primarily political. My main goal right now, I would say, is to shift from actually the theoretical to actually trying to change the system from within. I got citizenship, so I could run for office here, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to do that. But obviously, that takes money and support and some propaganda. Ha ha ha.
Yeah.
My
What
favorite word.
party would you join?
I don't know whoever will take me, but that's one thing
Right.
because as you may have noticed from my writings, I'm very much a political realist. And I
Yeah.
think this whole, especially even more so in Russia, this whole party thing, it's a joke. Excuse me.
Yeah.
It's a complete joke because you have the one main status quo party, which is the status quo, but everyone doesn't really like them. But then the other parties have really nothing to offer.
I- Is that
And so,
Putin's party?
yeah,
The status.
United Russia has a very firm kind of grip on things, but it's wearing away each election. In fact, the leader of the LDPR party there, he said, was it 6 months ago, that he really wants to take the other minor parties and try to create a two-party system. So
Yeah.
basically, you have the United
Who-
Russia versus everyone else would be the idea, because Russians are very envious of American stability. And
Yeah.
certain people, like Mr. Zhirinovsky, who I mentioned, who I hinted at, sees that that could be a really good way to create a stable transition transfer of power. Because you ever notice in
Yeah.
Russia, people do not transfer power very well. After monarchy went away, every transition of power is a fight because Lenin didn't even really want Stalin to come to power. He came to power
Yeah.
anyways. Had to kill Trotsky, had to kill the Trotskyites, get rid of them, right? Then Stalin dies. Here comes Khrushchev, who did everything he could to besmirch and just destroy every aspect of Stalin's personality and his accomplishments. Then he gets sent to work in the garden, as they say,
Yeah.
near the end of his career, which is I guess, a much more humane way of executing your enemies. Send them to go work in a garden. And then later on, we have a little bit of stability after Brezhnev, but ultimately then the chaos of the late 80s, early 90s. And then we have Putin sitting pretty for a very long time after Yeltsin. So as you see, there's been a almost complete failure, except for maybe from the Brezhnev to Andropov transfer of power. It's been rough and brutal, and I think a lot of the more intellectuals, not the average people. Average people aren't thinking about this. They've got their
Yeah.
lives to live, but the Russian intellectuals who are patriotic are like, guys, we every time the leader dies or it's
Yeah.
bad,
Yeah.
we've got to do something about this because Putin's in his late 60s.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that maybe if a two-party system could actually be achieved, but that's the thing, is it's a matter of what you can get yourself into the right position. If I was 16, I couldn't say, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to be this influential political and ideological writer in Russia. That's what I'm going to do. How could you do that? You
Yeah.
kind of don't know the road you're on. I just know that I now
Exactly.
have the opportunity to get into politics. What I can do, I can do. What I'd like to do is, if we have to usher in a two-party system in order to create stability here for the betterment of all, because even though we insult the two-party system in America, I can't deny, like I just said, it's really stable.
Yeah.
Right now, it's maybe the last 20 years since communism fell, it's been really letting us down. But
Yeah.
maybe if we got rid of the lobbyists, the two-party system would go back to being effective again.
Oh,
But anyways, I think in Russia, something has to happen in order to guarantee stability into the future. And that's a pretty decent option, and especially because all the party heads are old.
yeah.
Zhirinovsky from LDPR is old. Zyuganov is so old that he didn't even run for president this time. They gave it to someone else, who's Pavel Grudinin, who has his own successful sort of project as the leader of a kind of collective farm thing, mini city of his own. And then what is it, Mironov? Oh, I'm gonna look like such an idiot if I forget. I think Mironov for the Just Russia Party is also getting up there in years. So you have these guys who are really old, and they don't have anyone to transfer power to, really. And that's something that happens in Russia. You get this sort of guru who's at the middle, who can sort of create everything, and it gets built around him, but then there's no guy to take his place.
I was going to say that, in some ways, the American system might be kind of like that, in the sense that the two-party system can be seen as one party, and that if you're like a green or a libertarian or some other force, I mean, it's like you're never going to get in. It's like you have to be like on the Democratic or Republican wing of the Party, if you want to take a kind of Pat Buchanan look at it.
But one thing is, if you want my honest opinion, I actually think the entire idea of this legislative branch that exists in the form of a bunch of people sitting in a room is so outdated and so insane and makes no sense whatsoever. So the whole idea of it's insane, but a two-party system would be a quick patch on the Russian system. But anyways, I think this whole idea, this massive Duma where you have hundreds of representatives who have no motivation to represent those who they're supposed to represent is just stupid. But anyways, that's me. So
But so what's your, in outside of Russia, we basically get Western views of Russia, which are critical and probably are caricatures. But if from you inside there would be, I'd like to get your view, because you've been criticizing the kind of Vladimir Putin's domination of the system. Now, the way it's portrayed outside of the West is that he's a dictator, he stifles opposition, that you're not allowed to oppose. And you did say earlier that, critiquing people by name and those in power is frowned upon. So, sorry. So someone listening in, how should they understand politics here? Is basically the Western reporting more or less accurate with maybe some
no, not even close. Just absolutely. They're in their own universe with their own truth, and they base the reporting based on their own truth. If you'll notice, there's a tendency in a lot of Western articles where they'll say something about the Russians present some sort of danger, be it militarily or something. And they say, ooh, the Russians are bad. But then in the end, they say, but don't worry because they're horribly corrupt and nothing, they can't do anything. There's just very much this, you'll see it in articles year after year. It's the, boo, Russians are evil or scary, but they're idiots and they're completely inept. And that goes back to the fact that Russians seem to be sort of the wrong type of European or non-European. And so I think it could even go back to the split between the Catholic and the Orthodox Church, where Russians are just sort of inherently wrong and inferior. And so you see that sort of reasoning everywhere. You also can't forget that big media sources are not independent. They all have their masters. And their masters are not particularly thrilled with the way things are going in Russia. And so what you have is, in Russia, you have enough freedom where you can, if you want to, sure, you can insult the president. You can write all sorts of horrible things, but it depends whether your boss is going to pay you to do that or not. So the Western press just sort of makes up whatever they want, and they don't care because people will read it and believe it because no one is going to be able to question it because it sounds reasonable and because they haven't heard any information to
So what's the difference between your criticism of Putin and the system there and the Western criticism?
Well, the internal criticism of Putin is, the Western one is, it's something about freedom and he's repressive. And then the Russians, their main things when Putin's approval rating has taken hits was after they made the state pension reforms, raising the age when you start to get the equivalent of Social Security by 5 years. His approval rating went down by like 10 points, and it's not going to come back till that's done. And Russians are very angry at the mishandling of the Maidan and the post-Maidan situation in Ukraine because many people there are Russian or Russia sympathetic or Russian speaking, and many of them have been murdered for their beliefs. So Russian people can see people just like them being martyred, killed, at the least spat upon publicly for their language of choice and their ethnicity. And from Moscow, I mean, they send humanitarian convoys, but this whole thing about Russia invaded the Ukraine isn't the same. What invasion? There's no invasion. Russia has all the goodies. If the United States or Russia or China attack someone, they have all the goodies. They have EMPs and all the other supersonic missiles. Ukraine would just be ash. It would be just
Yeah.
it'd be the media portrays war still to this day as World War II. Men with rifles and tanks. It's not going to be that. It's going to be highly technological.
Yeah.
It's going to be all missiles and rockets and all that. So yes, that was the one media thing. But essentially, the criticism from within Russia is Putin's not patriotic and not pro-Russian, not nationalist enough. That's usually the way
Okay.
people see him. Why aren't you doing more for us, the masses? You're kowtowing to this West too much. But really, the big things are, again, pay me, give me my pension, let me retire. I'm tired. I've worked my whole life. Let me just damn well retire
So
and deal with the situation in Ukraine. Save our people from being murdered. That's
so Putin's dominance of the system, of the political system, and the kind of one-party dominance there, that is, in your mind, it's not necessarily because of corruption or repression. It's more a cultural thing. It's what would you say?
Well, I could say it's a cultural thing. It's also a lack of competition, but someone would say that it's a conspiracy. They force down the competition. No, there's really no one. And especially because in Russia's a different country. Like, it's not like Ukraine where you can elect a comedian or I forget, was it Croatia or Slovenia where there's like some sort of like Playboy model is running. Like, this isn't a joke. Here you have to really actually be the leader. And so there's just really no competition. And there's also certain problems. Like, everyone says that the guy who might get the next call will be Shoigu, who is in charge of the military, previously in charge of the Ministry of Emergency Situations. The people who put out forest fires and deal with the ambulances. Because under his rule, both of those organizations have gotten much, much, much better. The military loves him, but he's like a Tuvan Buddhist, and he's not Russian. So they can't really pick him because someone could use that to manipulate some ignorant masses that, he's not their guy or whatever. But there's really just not a lot of candidates. There really aren't a lot of candidates of people to pick to be the leader.
Because Russia is so big, it's hard to.
It's hard to make everyone happy.
Right.
And also, they always talk about Russian propaganda. We also have to put this in context. If you look compared to the West, what other type of propaganda is there? All the stuff the Chinese people make is garbage and no one watches it. There really is nothing else. The West is like 90%, and then there's a trickle of stuff from Russia. Russians are actually not good at propaganda. Russia cannot make a successful movie. I'll get in trouble for saying that, but it's the truth, and I'm going to keep saying it. Have you seen a Russian movie in your theaters, or people being like, wow, that Russian TV? No. So Russia sucks at making this necessary, inspiring, motivating, soft power-ish media. Not very good at it. So in a lot of ways, if you've had the chance to talk to people within Russia's minor parties, I might get in trouble for this one, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to take the risk. Talk to someone in one of Russia's three. At the time, I was one of the three seated. And they said, give me a story. Okay, why don't you guys try more seriously to run for office? Here's some suggestions. Here's things you do. But that would take so much effort. That's the answer. They don't really try. They're happy with second place because there is this sort of thing of everyone gets happy in their hierarchy, and there really isn't much of a desire to do things. One of the other things is, in America, between conservatives, between your Dennis Prager and your Ocasio-Cortez, there's an intellectual fight. But everyone in Russia kind of believes the same thing.
Yeah.
It's, you know what I mean? Because even, the United Russia, LDPR, the communists and all, well, officially, they all believe that the military is a good thing. We should have a powerful military. Russia should be a powerful country. Russia should try to maintain its sovereignty. We should have a good pension program, although, if they're going to act on it. But basically, there's really no actual ideological fight. It's an illusion. So, because I used to say that Russian TV was stupid because you'd have these political talk shows. You have this group of Russian liberals who represent 2% of the population, who actually do have a different mentality, fighting against the 98%. And I was like, that's so stupid. Then you're like, wait, money-wise, it's 50-50.
Right.
It's that tiny sort of Moscow 2% ultra-liberals who are willing to work with the West and probably actually got their positions thanks to the chaos of the 1990s against us, the 98. And that's the real ideological fight. So when you're dealing with organizing parties, the masses more or less agree on stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's why you get in a lot of Russia, the sort of 70-80% of people vote for Putin, or 70-80% of people want this, 70-80% want that, 15% are more hardcore, and then there's a couple weirdos who want to become Germany. So
yeah. Do you think so? In terms of the geopolitics and where there's this insane Cold War, and I say it's insane because it doesn't seem to be based on on anything really except I suppose a feeling of threat by the West or something, because it's not like communism and capitalism, right? I mean, Russia doesn't have an anti-Western ideology like during the Cold War. It's I mean, it wants to be have a respectable place in the world order, and that's basically about it from how I understand it. But do you see any sort of resolve to this kind of new Cold War? What do you see as the genesis of this new Cold War?
Well, one thing about Russians would definitely rather be great than would rather let's see, if they're not great, then they would rather just not be at all. And I think that that's a lot of the reason why there was so much suicide and self-destructive behavior in the 90s. And yet every year now, suicide and drinking just keep going down and down and down because people feel that they have more respect. In fact, there was a CNN video where they portrayed this man. He was out in the middle of nowhere. And he lived in this really dumpy house. And they asked him about Putin. And he said something. This was a few years ago, too, by the way. And he said something to the effect of like, well, I don't know. He's made us strong again. Something like that. I don't know.
Yeah,
and the CNN reporter, of course, like, this idiot said that the leader made him strong. Look at the way he lives. He's so poor. Well, from a financial standpoint, maybe there's a validity to that. But in some sort of spiritual sense, for that man, being part of something great is apparently very important to him. So important that he doesn't really care that his house was definitely not in good repair. Okay, so that's sort of the first part of that. Now, we're going to get to geopolitics. Remember, with geopolitics, when you add the geo to the politics, you get these situations that are created by the landscape of the world, be it physical or financial or sometimes historical inertia. And that's going to cause certain conflicts. One of the reasons why the Soviet Union was only able to really create a permanent revolution in Cuba is because it's an island. It's isolated.
Yeah.
It's a lot harder to go down to South America, very, very far away. That's much, much closer to America, and try to create some revolution when you're going to be surrounded by enemy states who don't believe in that revolution. Whereas going down sort of the east front of going down from North Korea to China and then down to Vietnam and Cambodia and all that pushing was a little bit easier because the geography of it was just simply easier of people's opinions and their communists in power. So we're sort of taking human will out of it. Well, you have to go back then again to something that may sound very trite or overblown to some of your listeners. The Project for New American Century was a big deal. Our think tank put together this real project and you can see if you actually go through and take the time to read it, you could see that there's a lot of politicians who are gonna, they saw this as a real plan, right? One of the main goals of it is to not allow another country to rise as a competitor. That was the main objective of post-war America, according to this. When was it written? This sort of
was part of it. It was like a lot of neocons. Yeah.
Now, again, so that way, because in the beginning of the episode you mentioned how people say that I don't something about me when my sources or my opinions are wrong. So here's something that is not a source. I have no source for it, but it's something that's often repeated and may be true. They say that Trump has this sort of idea of Fortress America, where he kind of wants to go back to this Monroe Doctrine, which is geopolitically more strong, of essentially, sorry if anyone's listening in South America, to basically enslave South America. So the problem with China was Chinese people were too organized, too ancient. Now they've risen up. They have all of our factories. We need to go down and this is them thinking, not me. This is them thinking they need to take control of the savages in South America and force them to work. That's kind of that's an unwritten plan. That's the unwritten part of the unwritten plan. It's basically to dominate Central and South America and use that for exploitation, which sounds good to a Russian perspective. If you're in South America, probably not, but you can see Now, this is something that's hypothetical. Trump has not mentioned that he has this plan in his mind. I've never seen that anywhere.
Yeah.
Hypothetical, imposed idea onto Trump. But then you see that Brazil's had a power change. The very strong Trump-supported attempts to change power in Venezuela. The Bolivia thing that's happening, completely Trump-supported. We go out of there. Well, in Syria, let's just protect the oil fields so we can get some oil out of them, but otherwise we'll leave Syria. All of a sudden, outside of this Monroe Doctrine territory, Trump is a lot more flexible. This whole Ukraine thing, he'd kind of like to just give up on it, but he's stuck with it. He doesn't want to be accused of treason. Everything off of the North and South American continents, all of a sudden, Trump's a lot more flexible. Or like, too, with the Hong Kong thing. Not really a lot from Trump on that. Not too, they like us. That's cool. Communism's bad, but So now you're kind of seeing that if you look at the evidence, or maybe evidence is the right word, the tendencies, the circumstances, there could be truth to this Fortress America idea, and that's actually where Trump and certain people within his inner circle, outer circle, maybe even too, would like to take America, because it's a lot more sustainable than trying to dominate the entire world, because that's not going to work. But however, historically, really having a pretty strong grasp on North and South America and not allowing them, because remember, over time, this Monroe Doctrine worked. I mean, Europe lost Central and South America completely. And that's a lot more possible to do, because is anyone in Russia going to, especially now when Russia doesn't have some sort of wacky ideology like Soviet communism to enforce on people, whatever happens in Brazil happens in Brazil. Whatever.
Although, the Russian, there is a Russian presence in Venezuela, which is just 7 miles away from us. And so, I think the Russians and the Chinese appear to be taking it's similar to Syria in a sense. They don't want the regime change war to happen there. It seems like it. But do you think Russia and the United States will forever be in conflict? That it's something that even goes beyond communism and capitalism, or do you think there can be a partnership, or like when George Bush in 1991 in that first Iraq war, talked about the New World Order, and it was the Soviet Union actually, and the United States fought together against Saddam Hussein, and there was this talk of the New World Order that collapsed through basically American betrayal. But and Trump has talked about Russia, wanting to work with Russia, but that's been totally undermined by the Democrats and the media.
Well, can they? I think there is a little bit of political will. Common enemy is always a side, but really, again, it's going back to that Project for a New American Century mentality, where if we have this mentality where we're the only power, we're the only player on the block, well, then it's not going to work. When and if Washington acknowledges that there could be other centers of power in the world, maybe something productive could happen. But I don't know. I'm very skeptical that so many hundreds of years of history, and especially the still fresh Cold War, can just be so blown over. I think people should be very skeptical. It would take a lot of work to regain trust that's been lost pretty thoroughly. So, yeah.
So as an American in Russia, do you basically identify with Russia now that you're a Russian citizen and so forth?
Even before that, I definitely, if you're talking about in political views, there's a lot of ideas growing in Russia. There's a alternative ideological front that's it's kind of like, in some ways, the liberal status quo in Russia. Because remember, Russia is a liberal Western democracy on paper, and more or less that's the way it works. And a lot of the rich people in Russia are basically Western. And that's kind of the way it's always been. Russia's always had a very Western elite. But they're trying to keep the lid on a boiling pot of new ideas and new ways of thinking that are growing here and nowhere else. And so I think that's I definitely identify with that. That's definitely something I'm a part of. Because again, when I go back to America, it's like, okay, I could go. Well, actually, to be honest, if I was forced to live in America, I guess going back to Cleveland in my poor neighborhood would not be the end of the world because at least that's where I'm from and that's what I understand. But when you talk to people who are very ideological, it's like libertarians are kind of right sometimes. Like I could kind of see
Yeah.
that, but then again, remember with libertarianism, everything's about economics. Your
Yeah.
existence, your reason for you're an
Yeah.
economic actor. That's all you
Yeah.
are, and that's all that matters.
That's right.
No, the government could never ever humiliate you or make you do something stupid. If your employer wants to do it and there's a contract involved, they can
That's
humiliate
right.
you all you want. So I kind of agree with them, and
And it's
could
highly
buzz, yeah.
autistic.
But basically, so I sort of like in America, right? So I could go back. I could, I guess, hang out with some libertarians and kind of, if they came to power, my life would be okay. It'd be tolerable, but
Yeah.
it's not the same level of agreement that I have with people here. With usually more the social justice warriors, I am their blood enemy, so I can't go back to that.
Yeah.
What other mentalities are there? This typical standard status quo Republican mentality of everyone has to be nice, we all wear suits, and we're afraid to open our door when we drive through a black neighborhood. I'm not one
Yeah.
of those type of people. I can't do, you know what I mean? So besides certain groups, kind of, I'm really on the outs intellectually in the United States, and here I'm not. So that's important to me. I'm sure for other people it's not. There are definitely people
Yeah.
who are just
Yeah.
like,
Oh,
I've met people. Yeah.
have you been following this whole Groyper war with Nick Fuentes and Charlie Kirk? Have you been following that at
I
all?
didn't quite understand it. I know there's Pepe. Is the original artist
Yeah,
of
no,
Pepe?
this is like something. I think that
Um,
this is very much in line with your type of thinking.
yeah,
Like so it's kind of you mentioned Pat Buchanan,
yeah,
so this is kind of like a young movement that sees themselves as paleoconservatives, right?
yeah.
But they adopt the new language of the memes and all that kind of stuff. But it's America first, and it's kind of like I don't know if you know E. Michael Jones. It kind of takes bits of that. It takes like Christianity, identity.
Well, here's one thing about those guys. Although I'm not a Protestant, I'm Orthodox. About
Yeah,
Buchanan, Lou Rockwell, who actually does read my work, by the way, that's confirmed. Lou Rockwell, who else is in
great.
that sort of sphere? I'm kind of running out of having a bit of a mental flop. But anyways, with those guys, one thing that helps them is that since they're religious, they do have the side of their philosophy that says no. So
Yeah,
libertarianism is a lot better with religion because libertarianism is kind of like do whatever you want. No one can stop you in the government, but God can. And there's morality, and that morality, you better believe in it or you're in trouble because there's a real God. So I think that those kind of guys, the paleo conservatives, I guess myself and them, we could live together very happily. However, they're like 0.1% of the population. So I guess we can go by a golf course and meet on Sundays or something. But you know what I mean? Because
yeah.
paleoconservatism is not exactly going to be mainstream with the youngins nowadays. I might, if in terms of
But
America,
actually,
I might
what's
be the youngest guy
happening
there.
right now?
So, mhm.
But you should really check it out. This they call it the Groyper movement.
Yeah.
They're really shaking things up, and
Okay.
it's like they've been disrupting Donald Trump Jr. and Charlie Kirk is this TPUSA movement, and all over the country. It's a real it's a strong movement. I don't know how it's going to take, but it's fascinating what's going on.
Yeah.
It's really amazing. But that's interesting. So let's try to I suppose wrap the
Yeah, I'm gonna have to
work
get.
towards a conclusion.
Yeah.
Because so if is there a main message that you are trying to put out to the world, would you say?
Oh, oh boy, that's one I wish I could kind of had time to write that down in advance so I get it right. I would usually say more the entertainment stuff that I do.
Yeah.
It's that there are different cultures on the earth. That's fine. There's always going to be different cultures. We can all get along. Russia isn't evil, but also Russians are not out to get you. In fact, Russians really love America. I'll tell you that much, and the West. They love the way the buildings look and all that. And in a lot of ways, Russians are actually very angry that Western people hate themselves. If that makes any sense, like the Russians are sort of outraged. It's like,
Yeah.
but you've always been more advanced than we are and ahead of us, and now you say you hate yourselves. But but why? That's weird, very weird mentality. But anyways, on the more casual side, I would just say that like there is no enemy here. That's all fake. On a more deeper level, I would say that we in the like the way people thought in, I don't know, the 1800s. Okay, it was very boxed in. But women don't play baseball, so women can't play baseball, right? That's a feminist thing, but it could be anything. People are very boxed in, or they're just like, well,
Yeah.
mom, why should I go to church? Because we went to church. This 1800s mentality of you are German, so you're going to go fight for Germany, and you have to believe in our religion because you're German, and do this because you're German. That doesn't really work anymore. We kind of got into the 1900s where then we were told that, you could just do whatever you want. All of this like tradition and this, it doesn't matter. Like there was no reason. It was just repression. They just didn't let women play baseball because it was repression. Now we're in the 21st century, and we see that the mentality of Christian, or I say traditional religion, because it applies to Hinduism, it applies to all traditional religion, Islam too, but this sort of restrictive mentality of traditional religion that society was built on, there's a reason things were the way they were. There's a reason why men pretty much went out and worked and women stayed at home. Because even still today, when you're given the choice, who's going to go outside and pave the street? Who's going to go outside in the army? It's going to be 90% male, but it's 90%, not 100. And so, we're starting to only now understand the reason why for hundreds and hundreds of years, prosperous human society was deeply religious, deeply organized, very based in these traditions, and that has to come back, that glue, with enough freedom to have the creativity to maintain the modern economy we have. Maybe that's my sort of ultimate message.
Yeah.
And I think that can be very much realized in Russia, because Russian people are the most traditional still in Europe. You scratch, Napoleon is quoted as saying, although some people say he never said this, that if you scratch a Russian, you'll see a Mongol. Basically racist. That kind of like saying if you get under the skin, they're all those dirty Asians, right? That was, again, that's him saying dirty Asians, not me. Important nuance. Right. And I think in some ways, if you sort of scratch a modern Russian, you see a very ancient person. You see someone very traditional who believes in magic and who's basically Russians have the potential to revert, maybe not revert, to heal the damage caused to the world by the insanity of just total cultural destruction, especially in Europe of the 19th century. Russians have the opportunity, which sadly they're oftentimes not taking, have the opportunity to really put that big bandage on so we can heal and live a balanced future where we do have some liberal, enough freedom to think, but we also are bound to society and understand that humans are tribal. We're never going to escape this. So why not work for our tribe? You work for your tribe. We work for our tribe. Try to minimize any causes that could cause us to want to actually go to war with each other. And we'll live, okay, I guess. Maybe better and at least more moral than we're living now, at the minimum.
Yeah, it's a shame that, I mean, you mentioned, all the ideas in Russia. And there's a whole, like Dugin is someone that embodies that for me. Like when I look at his work, I mean, but there's a whole discourse of stuff there, and I guess really from the 19th century, it's been there. That unfortunately it's not been taken seriously enough in the West, and there is some sort of efflorescence going on right now. I think a real flowering of ideas that, because of this demonization of Russia, we're not taking seriously, and there's some serious intellectual probing going on there right now.
Well, if you want, I've had the chance to talk to Dugin on a few occasions, and I sort of asked him about that, we have these ideas. Why do you only write these highly intellectual, highly complicated books where, you have to read like Hegel and Schopenhauer and Heidegger before you can even begin to understand Nietzsche too. Also, you have to do all this. And he's like, well, if you think about it, all revolutions and big change, it's all comes from the top down. And that's very true in terms of Marxism. Everything was discussed in these little salons, and then it went from this intellectual elite down. The whole, oh my God, the Enlightenment and all that. Really, a lot of this liberal ideas, this was all read by intellectuals and then passed down. In fact, like even Catherine the Great was so enthralled by Voltaire that she would read the books that would eventually be one of the causes of to why her ancestors would be doomed to be shot in a basement. Or her not her ancestors, her progeny, descendants. Yeah. So so in a way, that's I think what he's oriented towards is becoming this maybe Marx-like figure, Voltaire-like figure, who's the starter, and then that goes somewhere else. But remember, I'm a simple man from out in the middle of the Midwest. I'm a simple guy, and I think that a lot of these ideas of great thinkers, including him, can be packaged for the masses because if it wasn't for the guys with rifles, the Russian Revolution would have never happened. Mao's Long March wouldn't have happened without men to march along it. Obviously, George Washington wouldn't have been able to be a general without guys to be a general over, So I think it's all possible. The problem is, to go back is I get accused of, everything you do, it's the Kremlin, money, you do. This apartment, I don't own it. I only own a small house, which I just released a video about. It looks, the Russian or Ukrainian possible trolls or Russian trolls or whoever trolls all could say it looks more like a dog kennel than a house. Fair enough. The problem is, I would do that kind of work. I don't have the money. I have to entertain people in order to feed my children and to feed myself and to continue to exist. And any of this intellectual stuff, unfortunately, remains just a hobby. So that's the problem. If someone's willing to pay me a Russian middle class to upper middle class salary, bring it on. Every idea you got, baby, I'll know how to sell it. But until then, I'm going to be forced with my buddy Joaquin and I to casually discuss this once every couple of weeks. So there you go.
All right. So I mean, you seem to me from our conversation here that you're in a good mental space.
Mentally.
You seem very at ease. You've gone through a lot of changes in your life, made major moves, and it seems like you're pretty happy where you are. Is that right? Would you have changed anything in your journey because you've had a really complex journey?
Maybe. We had the chance to buy this one apartment, and we just didn't quite have the money to it. But that's kind of a side thing. That's not that important. But the thing is, I've been very worried for years because I couldn't afford. Because remember, Moscow's like New York, right? And it's really hard to get ahead in New York and buy an apartment in New York unless you're some sort of really big, rich, big shot. And finally, I was able to, especially after citizenship, then it opened the opportunities to buy land. So I got the house and the land, and that's probably the final piece and sort of a lot of the happiness puzzle. There is one more piece, but I can't talk about it here. There's one kind of thing I'd like to work out. But overall, my life has gone really well. I'm a very happy person. I'll put it this way. If you ever find my body somewhere and someone says that I committed suicide, no. Didn't happen. It did not happen. I love life, and I want to live a long time, and I see a lot of opportunities. Like I said, the political career may just be starting because I want to be able to actually do things rather than talk about them. And overall, I think things are pretty good. But I try to live with not too many regrets. Maybe if one thing, I should have busted my butt more in my 20s. I think a lot of the things I could probably be doing the things I'm doing now at 38. How old am I? Almost 40. At the age of maybe 30 or 31, and I probably would have had more money before I had kids. So that way we could have actually, bought an apartment or a house or something, something like that. Some certain financial decisions or a lack of hustle when I was in my 20s, but that's not the end of the world. Things are all right.
Good. Well, what would you recommend to a young person listening to this podcast right now? What would be your advice to a younger person? Given what's happening in the world, what's the kind of confusions they might have about modernity and tradition and what to do and all the things and choices facing them. I mean, you had to, in a sense, leave the United States to kind of find yourself in a way.
Yeah, and to sort of enter a different historical context. Advice would be to know that there's a lot of things that you don't know. That goes back to, what was that speech? The known unknowns, and everyone laughed at it.
Yeah.
What was that, Rumsfeld?
Yeah, Rumsfeld. It was Rumsfeld.
Unfortunately, what he said actually does make sense because there are known unknowns. And you have to know that there's a lot of things you don't know. There's a lot of ways that people have lived on this planet. There's been a lot of different structures, styles of life, and a lot of things that were think we know, the way the past was presented, it's not exactly accurate. And basically, start thinking and don't accept the status quo of the way things are, and have the humility to be pretty sure that if your entire life you've been lied to by the media and lied to by politicians, then how do you know that anything is true? Think about that one. So yeah, I think that that's probably a good one. And also maybe with the young people, don't be afraid to make bold decisions, especially while you're young, and don't wait, because eventually you got to have kids, right? We're gonna get married and have kids. I waited maybe just a little bit too long to do that. If you're 18, just go nuts. And here's another one. Don't think that any educational system is going to make you successful. Only you can make you successful. That's another thing where I have this ghetto mentality. It's like, well, if I go to college, they're going to make me successful. Yeah. And all I have to do is get this degree and then I'll have a job lined up. No. You've got to make yourself successful.
Yeah. And in any projects you've got coming up, or anything you plan to do that you want to make people aware of?
Well, it's one thing is I've been trying to for a long time. In fact, the one little podcast where it's just me on the Center for Syncretic Studies, to remind people, Center for Syncretic Studies and the Strategic Culture Foundation. That's where my serious work is at now. I tried to do this podcast, but unfortunately I've been really busy because I have to remodel my house myself, because I bought a house with cash. I didn't want to go into debt. So that means I have to do all this remodeling work myself, so I have enough time. But the one podcast is actually, each episode of the podcast is eventually going to be a chapter in a book, and I'm going to try to publish the book that contains all of my thoughts, both insane and non-insane, into one big book to sort of my magnum opus. It's mostly written, but the thing is, doing something with the podcast and talking to myself and hearing myself talk about these ideas kind of helps me see the flaws in them.
Yeah.
And so I want to go through and do this also series of podcasts. Also, podcasts are more attractive. I think it's sort of more attractive for people if some guy's like, hey, I've got this book about my ideological musings. Buy it for $20 hardback and then take the time to read it. That's a lot different than like, there's this Center for Syncretic Studies. They're kind of cool. Oh, there's the one guy, the beard guy. Oh, that's kind of interesting. I'll get into that. And then later, maybe they'll see the totality of what I'm trying to say here. But essentially, the objective of the book is not just ideological musings, but because I guess I'm American. Here's something super American. I like things practical. Even Dugan one time said something about Americans. Americans just ask, does it work? That's our main thing. Does this work or not? And that's, I guess, one way I'm very American. And in a lot of ways, all these Russian idea people can sit around and talk to each other in dark clothing and dark rooms and feel impressive, but they have to produce something. And so in a lot of ways, I'm trying to compile these ideas into some sort of structure that someone could actually advocate for. Like I was telling you about how I think the legislative branch is sort of pointless in a lot of societies, because it's just this massive room of people who are supposed to represent these regions, and they don't do it. And human beings don't function this way. For example, we always talk about presidential candidates. He's not qualified. Well, any law about medicine that goes through the U.S. Congress, how many people have a medical background? 5, 3?
Exactly.
But 435 vote on it. So it's this whole thing where I think we need to eliminate that. And also we need to go maybe back in time. I was just having a big discussion about, I'm not an expert in ancient Rome. Hold on, no expertise. Again, we're putting the hands up because I have to stop people because I can see the future of hateful comments. Roman patronage, how there'd be successful or established Romans, they're the patrons, and then they would have their clients, and they'd have that relationship where the clients respect the patrons. And that's something where I can even see that, despite the fact that systemically we're not allowed to have that, that's not a part of democracy, you see that everywhere. So why do we deny that? Why don't we actually even look at the Roman way of thinking, the Roman system of doing things? Because we kind of had a realistic way of sort of looking at the world, So I think we have to really reevaluate a lot of ideas, especially coming up to democracy's 300th birthday-ish? Of course, democracy doesn't have a starting date, but the Enlightenment is 300 years? It's time to reflect.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I want to thank you very much, for this interview and really for all your work and the stuff you've been doing. I'll put the links to the Center for Syncretic Studies and the Strategic Is it Strategic
Culture Foundation.
Culture Foundation?
Yeah, you can do it. They have a thing called contributors. You can link it directly to my page if people are mostly interested.
Okay, great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll do that. I encourage everybody to take a read of it. You've got some excellent stuff up there.
Uh-huh.
You know, what you're doing is really important, and more people should really know about it.
Mm-hmm.
So I wish you, the Strategic Culture Foundation, and the Center for Syncretic Studies all the best and every success in your endeavors ahead. Thanks again.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Well, that's all for Independent Thought and Freedom this week. Please join us again next week. And in the meanwhile, make sure you subscribe, leave me a rating, and like and share this podcast with your friends. Thanks, and bye for now.